Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start part 3 of Little Blue Book number 42, titled The Origin of the Human Race, written by G. Schwalbe. Okay. All right, here we go. We'll backtrack here a little bit. I shall have something to say in regard to the genetic relations of these forms, one to another, when discussing the different theories of descent current at the present day. In quite a different domain from that of morphological relationships, namely in the physiological study of the blood, results have recently been gained which are of the highest importance to the doctrine of descent. Uhlenhuth Nuttall, Uhlenhuth, Uhlenhuth Nuttall, and others have established the fact that the blood serum of a rabbit which has previously had human blood injected into it forms a precipitate with human blood. I'm not sure what that means. It's precipitate. Yeah. Thus, biological reaction was tried with a great variety of mammalian species, and it was found that those far removed from man gave no precipitate under these conditions. But as in other cases, among mammals, all nearly related forms yield an almost equally marked precipitate. So the serum of a rabbit treated with human blood and then added to the blood of an anthropoid ape gives almost as marked a precipitate as in human blood. The reaction to the blood of the lower eastern monkeys is weaker than to the western monkeys, weaker still. And indeed, in this last case, there is only a slight clouding after a considerable time, and no actual precipitate. The blood of the lemur gives no reaction, or an extremely weak one. That of the other mammals, none whatsoever. We have in this not only a proof of the literal blood relationship between man and apes, but the degree of relationship with the different main groups of apes can be determined beyond possibility of mistake. Finally, it must be briefly mentioned that in regard to remains of human handcraft, also, the material at our disposal has greatly increased of late years, that, as a result of this, the opinions of archaeologists have undergone many changes, and that in particular, their views in regard to the age of the human race have been greatly influenced. There is a tendency at the present time to refer to the origin of man back to territory times. Yeah. It is true that no remains of tertiary man have been found, but flints have been discovered which, according to the opinion of most investigators, bear traces either of use or of very primitive workmanship. Since Routat's time, following Millet's example, investigators have called these eloths. Eloths? Yeah. And they have been traced back by Verworn to the Miocene of Vergane, and by Rutt even in the upper Oligocene. Although these eloths are even nowadays the subject of many different views, the preoccupation with them has kept the problem of the age of the human race continually before us. Geology, too, has made great progress since the days of Darwin and Lowell, and has endeavored with satisfactory results to arrange the human remains of the diluvial period in chronological order. I do not intend to enter upon the question of the primitive home of the human race, since the space at my disposal will not allow of my touching even very briefly upon all the departments of science which are concerned in the problem of the descent of man. How Darwin would have rejoiced over each of the discoveries here briefly outlined. What use he would have made of the new and precise material which would have prevented the discouragement from which he suffered when preparing the second edition of the Descent of Man. But it was not granted to him to see this progress towards filling up the gaps in his edifice of which he was so painfully conscious. He did, however, have the satisfaction of seeing his ideas steadily gained ground, notwithstanding much hostility and deep-rooted prejudice. Even in the years between the appearance of The Origin of Species and of the first edition of the Descent, the idea of a natural descent of man, which was only briefly indicated in the work of 1859, had been eagerly welcomed in some quarters. It has been already pointed out how brilliantly Huxley contributed to the defense and diffusion of Darwin's doctrines. Defense and diffusion of Darwin's doctrines, and how in man's place in nature he has given us a classic work as a foundation for the doctrine of the descent of man. As Huxley was Darwin's champion in England, so in Germany Karl Vogt in particular made himself master of the Darwinian ideas. But above all, it was Haeckel who, in energy, eagerness for battle, and knowledge, may be placed side by side with Huxley, who took over the leadership in the controversy over the new conception of the universe. As far back as 1866, in his General Morphology, he had inquired minutely into the question of the descent of man, and not content with urging merely the general theory of descent from lower animal forms, he drew up for the first time genealogical trees showing the close structural relationships of the different animal groups. The last of these illustrated the relationships of mammals, and among them of all groups of the primates, including man. It was Haeckel's genealogical trees that formed the basis of the special discussion of the relationships of man in the 6th chapter of Darwin's Descent of Man. In the last section of this essay, I shall return to Haeckel's conception of the special descent of man, the main features of which he still upholds, and rightly so. Haeckel has contributed more than anyone else to the spread of the Darwinian doctrine. I can only allow myself a few words as to the spread of the theory of the natural descent of man in other countries. The Parisian anthropological school, founded and guided by the genius of Broca, took up the idea of the descent of man and made many notable contributions to it. In England itself, Darwin's work did not die. Huxley took care of that, for he, with his lofty and unprejudiced mind, dominated and inspired English biology until his death on June 29th of 1895. He had the satisfaction shortly before his death of learning of Du Bois' discovery, which he illustrated by a humorous sketch. But there are still many followers in Darwin's footsteps in England. Keene has worked at the special genealogical tree in the primates. Keith has inquired which of the anthropoid apes has the greatest number of characters in common with man. Morris concerns himself with the evolution of man in general, especially with his acquisition of the erect position. The recent discoveries of Pithecanthropus and Homo primigenius are being vigorously discussed, but the present writer is not in a position to form an opinion of the extent to which the idea of descent has penetrated throughout England generally. In Italy, independent work in the domain of the descent of man is being produced, especially by Morselli. With him, are associated in the investigation of related problems. Sergei and Geoffrida Ruggieri. From the ranks of American investigators, we may single out in particular the eminent geologist Cope, who championed with much decision the idea of the specific difference of Homo neanderthalis and maintained a more direct descent of man from the fossil lemur. In South America, too, in Argentina, new life is stirring in this department of science. A Megino in Buenos Aires has awakened the fossil primates of the Pampas Formation to new life. He even believes that in his tetraprothemo, represented by a femur, has been discovered a direct ancestor of man. Lehmann Nietzsche is working at the other side of the gulf between apes and man, and he describes a remarkable first cervical vertebrae from Mount Hermosa as belonging to a form which may bear the same relation to Homo sapiens in South America as Homo primigenus does in the Old World. After a minute investigation, he establishes a human species, Homo negerus, while Megahino ascribes this atlas vertebrae to his tetraprohomo. Thus, throughout the whole scientific world, there is arising a new life, an eager endeavor to get near to Huxley's problema maximum, to penetrate more deeply into the origin of the human race. There are today very few experts in anatomy and zoology who deny the animal descent of man in general. Religious considerations, old prejudices, the reluctance to accept man, who so far surpasses mentally all other creatures, as descend from soulless animals, prevent a few investigators from giving full adherence to the doctrine. But there are very few of these who still postulate in special act of creation for man, although the majority of experts in anatomy and zoology accept unconditionally the descent of man from lower forms. There is much diversity of opinion among them in regard to the special line of descent. In trying to establish any special hypothesis of descent, whether by the graphic method of drawing up genealogical trees or otherwise, let us always bear in mind Darwin's words and use them as a critical guiding line. As we have no record of the lines of descent, the pedigree can be discovered only by observing the degrees of resemblance between the beings which are to be classed. Darwin carries tags which are to be classed. Now, Darwin carries this further by stating that resemblances in several unimportant structures, in useless and rudimentary organs, or not now functionally active, or in an embryological condition, are by far the most serviceable for classification. It has also to be remembered that numerous separate points of agreement are of much greater importance than the amount of similarity or dissimilarity in a few points. The hypotheses as to descent current at the present day may be divided into two main groups. The first group seeks for the roots of the human race not among any of the families of the apes, the anatomically nearest forms, nor among their very similar but less specialized ancestral forms, the fossil representatives of which we can know only in part, but setting the monkeys on one side, it seeks for them lower down among the fossil, Eocene, pseudo-lemur or lemuridae, or even among the primitive pentodactylus Eocene forms, which may either have led directly to the evolution of man, or have given rise to an ancestral form common to apes and man. The common ancestral form from which man and apes are thus supposed to have arisen independently may explain the numerous resemblances which actually exist between them. That is to say, all the characters upon which the great structural resemblance between apes and man depends must have been present in their common ancestor. Let us take an example of such a common character. The bony external ear passage is in general as highly developed in the lower eastern monkeys and the anthropoid apes as in man. This character must therefore have already been present in the common primitive form. In that case, it is not easy to understand why the western monkeys have not also inherited the character, instead of possessing only a tympanic ring. But it becomes more intelligible if we assume that forms with a primitive tympanic ring were the original type, and that from these were evolved, on the one hand, the existing New World monkeys with persistent tympanic ring, and on the other, an ancestral form common to the lower Old World monkeys, the anthropoid apes, and man. For man shares with these the character in question, and it is also one of the unimportant characters required by Darwin. Thus, we have two divergent lines arising from the ancestral form, the western monkeys on the one hand, and an ancestral form common to the lower eastern monkeys, the anthropoid apes and man on the other hand. But considerations similar to those which showed it to be impossible that man should have developed from an ancestor common to him and the monkeys, yet outside of and parallel with these, may be urged also against the likelihood of a parallel evolution of the lower eastern monkeys, the anthropoid apes, and man. The anthropoid apes have in common with man many characters which are not present in the lower old world monkeys. These characters must therefore have been present in the ancestral form common to the three groups. But there again, it is difficult to understand why the lower eastern monkeys should not also have inherited these characters. That just throws me off that they're using the word character instead of characteristics. As this is not the case, there remain no alternative but to assume divergent evolution from an indifferent form. The lower eastern monkeys are carrying on the evolution in one direction, I might almost say towards a blind alley, while anthropods and men have struck out a progressive path, at first in common, which explains the many points of resemblance between them, without regarding man as derived directly from the anthropods. Their many striking points of agreement indicate a common descent, and cannot be explained as phenomena of convergence. I believe I have shown in the above sketch that a theory which derives man directly from lower forms without regarding apes as transition types leads ad absurdum. The close structural relationship between man and monkeys can only be understood if both are brought into the same line of evolution. To trace man's line of descent directly back to the old Eocene mammals alongside of, but with no relation to these very similar forms, is to abandon the method of exact comparison, which, as Darwin rightly recognized, alone justifies us in drawing up genealogical trees on the basis of resemblance and differences. The farther down we go, the more does the ground slip from beneath our feet. Even the lemurs show very numerous divergent conditions, much more so the Eocene mammals, the chief resemblance of which to man consists in the possession of pentadactylous hands and feet. Thus, the farther course of the line of descent disappears in the darkness of the ancestry of the mammals. With just as much reason, we must pass by the vertebrates altogether and go back to the lower invertebrates. But in that case, it would be much easier to say that man has arisen independently and has evolved without relation to any animals, from the lowest primitive form to his present isolated and dominant position. But this would be to deny all value to classification, which must, after all, be the ultimate basis of a genealogical tree. We can, as Darwin rightly observed, only infer the line of descent from the degree of resemblance between single forms. If we regard man as directly derived from primitive forms very far back, we have no way of explaining the many points of agreement between him and the monkeys in general, and the anthropoid apes in particular. There must remain an inexplicable marvel. Oh, these must remain. I have thus, I trust, shown that the first class of special theories of descent, which assumes that man has developed parallel with a monkey, but without relation to them, from very low primitive forms, cannot be upheld, because it fails to take into account the close structural affinity of man and monkeys. I cannot but regard this hypothesis as lamentably retrograde, for it makes impossible any application of the facts that have been discovered in the course of the anatomical and embryological study of man and monkeys, and indeed prejudges and prejudices investigations of that class as pointless. The whole method is perverted. An unjustifiable theory of descent is first formulated with the aid of the imagination, and then we are asked to declare that all structural relations between man and monkeys and between the different groups of the latter are valueless, the fact being that they are the only true basis on which a genealogical tree can be constructed. So much for this modern method of classification, which has probably found adherents because it would deliver us from the relationship to apes, which many people so much dislike. In contrast to it, we have the second class of special hypothesis of descent, which keeps strictly to the nearest structural relationships. This is the only basis that justifies the drawing up of a special hypothesis of descent. If this fundamental proposition be recognized, it will be admitted that the doctrine of special descent upheld by Haeckel and set forth in Darwin's Descent of Man is still valid today. In the genealogical tree, man's place is quite close to the anthropoid apes. These again have as their nearest relatives the lower Old World monkeys, and their progenitors must be sought among the less differentiated Platyrrhine monkeys, whose most important characters have been handed on to the present day New World monkeys. How the different genera are to be arranged within the general scheme indicated depends in the main on the classificatory value attributed to individual characters. This is particularly true in regard to Pithecanthropus, which I consider as the root of a branch which has sprung from the anthropoid ape root and has led up to man. The latter I have designated the family of the hominid. For the rest, there are, as we have said, various possible ways of constructing the narrower genealogy within the limits of this branch, including man and apes, and these methods will probably continue to change with the accumulation of new facts. Haeckel himself has modified his genealogical tree of the primates in certain details since the publication of his General Morphology in 1866, but its general basis remains the same. All the special genealogical trees drawn up on the lines laid down by Haeckel and Darwin and that of Du Bois may be specially mentioned, are based in general on the close relationship of monkeys and men, although they may vary in detail. Various hypotheses have been formulated on these lines with special reference to the evolution of man. Philocanthropus is regarded by some authorities as the direct ancestor of man, by others as a sidetracked failure in the attempt at the evolution of man. The problem of the monopolectic or polypolectic origin of the human race has also been much discussed. Sergei inclines towards the assumption of a polyphyletic origin of the three main races of man, the African primitive form of which was given rise also to the gorilla and chimpanzee, the Asiatic to the orangutan and gibbon, and Pithecanthropus. Coleman regards existing human races as derived from small primitive races, pygmies, and considers that Homo primigenus must have arisen in a secondary and degenerative manner. But this is not the place, nor have I the space, to criticize the various special theories of descent. One, however, must receive particular notice. According to Amagino, the South American monkeys, from the oldest tertiary of the pampas are the forms from which have arisen the existing American monkeys on the one hand, and on the other, the extinct South American homunculdia, which are also small forms. From these last, anthropoid apes and man have, he believes, been involved. Among the progenitors of man, Amagino reckons the forms discovered by him, from which a South American primitive man, Homo pampeus, might be directly evolved, while, on the other hand, all the lower Old World monkeys may have arisen from older fossil South American forms, the distribution of which may be explained by the bridge formerly existing between South America and Africa, as may be the derivation of all existing human races from Homo pampas. The fossil forms discovered by Amagino deserve the most minute investigation, as does also the fossil man from South America, on which Lehmann Nietzsche has made a thorough study. Man. It is obvious that, notwithstanding the necessary for fitting man's line of descent into the genealogical tree of the primates, especially the apes, opinions in regard to it differ greatly in detail. This could not be otherwise, since the different primate forms, especially the fossil forms, are still far from being exhaustively known. But one thing remains certain: the idea of the close relationship between man and monkeys set forth in Darwin's Descent of Man. Only those who deny the many points of agreement, the sole basis of classification, and thus of a natural genealogical tree, can look upon the position of Darwin and Haeckel as antiquated, or as standing on an insufficient foundation. For such a genealogical tree is nothing more than a summarized representation of what is known in regard to the degree of resemblance between the different forms. Darwin's work in regard to the descent of man has not been surpassed. The more we immerse ourselves in the study of the structural relationships between apes and man, the more is our path illuminated by the clear light radiating from him. And through his calm and deliberate investigation, based on a mass of material in the accumulation of which he has never had an equal, Darwin's fame will be bound up for all time with the unprejudiced investigation of the question of all questions, the descent of the human race. And that is the end of the chapter, and I think that will be the end of this part of Little Blue Book number 42, titled The Origin of the Race of Man, or of Human Beings. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 4.